I am awoken at 3:13 in the morning. My eyes bolt open. This has become a frequent occurrence over the last few months. It's not every night, just often enough to make me wary of the fact that I am. I awake, exhausted, yet the faint insomnia that resides in the back of my mind fuels me and energizes me into a hypnotic-like state. My body is motionless, paralyzed from my slumber, yet my mind thrives and pleads me to stand as my thoughts race around my head like a lightning bolt. For a brief moment, I forget who I am, but soon recall. I grip the side of my bed to remember where I am. I run my hands down my legs to ensure I'm in one piece. Strange, I know. But reoccurring night visions have led me into checking that I am still there. I am. The speaker next to my bed sounds. It is a cry. A familiar cry. The cry of a baby. The cry of my baby. I have a baby. A newborn daughter. Eva. 12 pounds and 6 ounces. Underweight. Medicinal treatment is required. 4 months, 20 days old. 4 months and 20 sleepless nights. The speaker keeps crying. The tired, soft voice next to me sounds. Your turn. It is my fiancée, yet to be married. Met her at a party, we connected, we fell in love. We plan to share a future together. Money's tight, but we survive. We can't afford to marry just yet. The cry sound is louder. Will you go and quiet her down? My head is pounding. I comply. I'm awake. I sit up. I rub my eyes. I stand. I leave the comfort of my bed and exit the solitude of my room. The corridor is dark, though I don't turn the lights on. I recollect the number of steps it takes to get from my room to my daughter's. 6 steps forward, second door to the right. Small bedroom. I open the door. The soft blue lights and gentle tings of a harp that play Hush by a Mountain from my daughter's mobile suspending 78 inches from the ceiling welcome me. I step over to my daughter's cot. She continues to cry. I pick her up. I lull her back to sleep with a series of shh and hums. I rock her gently back and forth. She eventually silences. I kiss her head and place her back into her bed. I leave the room. 1 step forward, 4 steps to the right. First door opposite the stairs. The bathroom. I close the door. I turn the light on. I'm momentarily blinded as I feel my eyes adjust to the piercing white light of the ceiling. I face the toilet and I urinate. I finish. I look into the mirror. I watch my pupils dilate as they continue to acclimatize to the brightness. I notice my figure is deterred. There used to be a time where I possessed a somewhat athletic figure. 6 foot 2 inches in height, muscular, 14 stone exactly. I could run for miles without getting tired. I thrived to keep fit. I was healthy. I haven't been eating well recently. Haven't eaten for a couple of months. Don't feel the need to. I've now dropped to 10 stone and 7 pounds. The bones of my ribs stick out my skin. My eyes have sunken and darkened due to lack of sleep. What became muscle was now disappeared as my body eats away at itself to survive. I'm a shadow of my former self. I cannot bear to look at what stares back at me in the mirror. I splash my face with cold water. Its icy touch reminds me that I'm still here. I hear a cry, a familiar cry, the cry of a baby, the cry of my baby. I have a baby, a newborn, a daughter, Eva, 10 pound 4 ounces, dangerously underweight. Medicinal treatment and medical persistence is necessary. 6 months, 5 days old, 6 months and 5 sleepless nights. She keeps crying. She wants her father. The light, hoarse voice of my fiancé in the next room sounds. Check on Eva. My head is pounding. My fiancé's health is also deterred. Her once exuberant eyes, so full of life and excitement, are now dulling. Her once soft and tender lips are now pale and cracked. Her once beautiful and loving face, which I once fell in love with, is now a mere gaunt expression. I try not to look at her. I check on the baby. 1 step forward, 11 shuffles of effort to the left, the last door on the right. I open the door. The calming blue light of the mobile suspended 75 inches above the ceiling begins to flicker. The calming sound of the heart becomes distorted and fuzzes into an unrecognizable tune as the battery slows down to die. I pick her up. She is small, dainty and delicate. I do not hold her tight over fear she would be crushed. I lull her back to sleep with a series of tiresome shh and hums. I feel her rest her petite head on my bony shoulder. She is cold. I bring her to our room. It is now 4:14 in the morning. There is nothing but silence in the house. I return to the bedroom with my frail daughter in my arms. 14 shuffles of effort to the right, and into the last door before the stairs. I delicately place my sleeping daughter next to my ailing fiancé. I sit by the window and gaze at the sky. It is clear. There are no stars. The wilting light of a darkened moon attempts to illuminate the night scene. I breathe in the brisk night air and let it fill my lungs. I feel dazed and weary. I make my way back to the bed to join my sleeping fiancé and daughter. We cuddle one another for warmth. My eyelids grow heavy. My will to stay awake weakens. I drift to sleep. I am awoken at 3:13 in the morning. My eyes bolt open. My body is motionless, paralyzed from my slumber. Yet my mind thrives and pleads me to stand. As my thoughts race around my head like a lightning bolt, for a brief moment I forget who I am. But soon I recall. I grip the side of my bed to remember where I am. I run my hands down my legs to ensure I'm in one piece. I am. I sit up, I rub my eyes, I stand. I do not hear the cry of my daughter. I do not hear the voice of my fiancé. I leave my bedroom. The corridor is dark. Though I don't turn the lights on, I recollect the number of steps it takes to get from my room to my daughter's. 6 steps forward, second door to the right. The small bedroom. I open the door. The room is dark. The calming blue light of the mobile has burnt out. The hush-a-by of the harp is now an infrequent faint electrical cackle. The mobile lies unsuspended on the floor, 18 inches from the cot. I go to pick up my daughter Eva, 6 pounds, 4 ounces, severely underweight. Medicinal treatment and medical attention is desperately needed. She is delicate. I do not hold her tight over fear she will break. She is so small, so dainty, so cold. I bring her back to my room and place her in bed next to her mother. She says nothing. They lie next to each other. I watch. They're so thin and pale, scalatial. I lean over and kiss the soft head of my daughter. I kiss the dry lips of my fiancé and stroke her straw-like hair that entangles between my fingers. I feel her wound, 3 inches from the back of her eye, 4 inches deep, 17 strikes, a cracked skull, a bludgeoned head. The icy touch of a woman's blood against my skin reminds me I'm still here. I pick up my daughter and hold her close. I squeeze her tight in the hope that I can feel her close to me again. I hear her tiny brittle bones snap and crack against my own, as her lifeless head drops back over her neck. I stand over and look back into the barren eyes of my fiancée, as she looks up at me with an empty look of question. As I hold the broken corpse of my child, I scream aloud. I drop my daughter to the ground. I shout meaningless words into the face of my dead fiancé. I silence and listen to the ringing of my echo. I stand. I rub my eyes. I sit. My eyelids grow heavy. My will to stay awake weakens. I clamber back into bed and drift to sleep, my family by my side, huddled together for warmth. I am awoken at 3:13 in the morning. My eyes bolt open. This has become a frequent occurrence over the last few months. It's not every night, just often enough to make me wary of the fact that I am. I wake exhausted, yet the faint insomnia that resides in the back of my mind fuels me and energizes me into a hypnotic state. My body is motionless, paralyzed from my slumber, yet my mind thrives and pleads me to stand as my thoughts race around my head like a lightning bolt. She was quietly strolling down the street, gazing up towards Big Ben, snow gently falling around her. She was in London, and along with so many waiting for the new year, it would mark the anniversary of when she had first delved into the world of Creepypasta, of which she was extremely afraid. Genevieve had always been the girl waiting patiently for the scary bits to be over, huddled in the corner with the fortress of shivering blankets. She'd always been the kid that still used a nightlight, the one that you didn't invite to sleepovers. Despite these facts, however, she had many friends in school. Genevieve was alone now though. It was the first year out of high school, and she had waited so long to be able to be alone and not worry about school. She was taking classes online so she'd be able to leave her old home in America and see Europe. The ancient bell tower began its almost calming chant as she stopped. The minute and hour hand both on 12 o'clock. The snow seemed to stop for a moment. It was like something out of her fantasies. One of the many that she had written as a child in a journal. A once upon a time journal. She had it with her, and as she relaxed in Central Park, she remembered in her mind the latest entry named The Clock Man. Once upon a time, there was a young man that had an extraordinary talent for fixing clocks. Charles worked in his father's clock and antiques shop, 1053 Blackthorn Road. There he would help anyone that came into the shop with something that needed repair. That was all she had written so far, and she decided to flip the notebook, noticing something strange had happened. Below the first paragraph, more words were written in a scrawl hardly legible and resembling the illegible words of a toddler, only with the vocabulary of an adult. One day he was walking down the streets of London, just past midnight, preparing to confront the new year, when he saw a figure slightly shivering in Central Park. Pulling out an eraser, she went to erase the words, but before she could, the sound of footsteps approached. "Aren't you freezing, miss?" a voice above her asked. Genevieve looked up to see a man, no more than a year older than herself, with black curls to match his clockwork patterned scarf, and otherwise plain clothes. He was staring down at her, sharp bronze eyes in a perfectly carved marble bust, meeting her own emerald green pupils. For a moment, she simply stared before remembering her manners. No, I'm fine, really," she insisted. She didn't want him to think that she was weak, even though she had just met this mysterious stranger. Something about the way he acted made her ever so slightly nervous. He stared at her quizzically a little longer before a smirk formed on his face. "Oh, of course you are. Well, come in when your watch freezes from the cold," he chuckled, pulling a business card out of thin air and placing it inside of her open journal. She was startled, looking down for a moment to see if her watch was visible. It wasn't. So how had he known she was wearing one? She looked back up to ask, but the mystery man had disappeared. All she had as proof that he ever existed was the business card that he had put down almost as a bookmark. Genevieve lifted her journal back up to look at it some more. Brushing off some snow, she noticed that more words had appeared. Almost immediately, she declined his help, and after a moment, he left to return to the shop. The new writing was slightly neater, and she decided that maybe this was all a dream. Standing up, she left the business card for the morning and began the short walk home. January 3rd, 2013. She hadn't slept at all in the past 2 nights since she had met that man. Her journal lay untouched, and Genevieve had decided to finally look at his card. When she tried to sleep before, only nightmares had come, and she would wake up to the sound of a distant clock ticking, even though there were none that made that noise in her small flat. Now, it was 2 in the morning. Sitting at her dining table, she let the journal fall open to where the card was. Instead of looking at the card, however, she found herself staring at the page where her own neat handwriting printed more to the story, even though she hadn't opened the journal in 2 days. Unease rippling through her mind, she slowly read the lines of text. The lady spent the next couple of days restless, trying to focus on what had happened. Finally, 3 days after the incident, she noticed that a single token she had from the experience, a card, had an address she recognized almost instantly. It was the address for James and Charles's clock shop at 1053 Blackthorn Road. Genevieve's stomach churned with queasiness. She picked up the card, turning it to read what was printed on the cardstock. She anticipated something to happen when she turned the card over, but when she did, the ink had been smudged, rendered useless. It was as if nothing had been typed in the first place. She felt almost disappointed and decided to forget about the entire thing. Putting her journal away, she tossed the card in the trash and decided to do some studying. January 5th, 2013. It was midday. The snow had stopped long enough for the sunlight to stream through the open window, and Genevieve was laying on her bed. There was a knock from her door. Given that it was 10:30 AM, this wasn't surprising, so she reluctantly got up and then stumbled over to the door. The last couple of days hadn't been good. She'd been putting entries on her blog with pictures of her once upon a time journal and writing down the next new text that was appearing. It was as if the journal was telling the future, and her latest post from earlier that morning had revealed that it had predicted she would get a visitor to change something important. So naturally, Genevieve had laid down in good clothes, hoping for the best. Opening the door, she was surprised to see the mysterious man from New Year's. "Is that watch of yours still working?" he asked, not even saying hello before stepping inside through the gap between her and the doorframe. Fine," she stuttered. Her watch sat on top of her dresser, and she watched as he seemed to almost instantly teleport across the large room to it to examine its face. "No, it isn't. Come with me to my shop and I can fix it for you." She had barely spoken a word before he ushered her out of her own house and into a black car that had made fresh tire marks in the snow piled in her driveway and then drove away. Where are you taking me?" she asked nervously. The car seemed almost unnaturally perfect, and she felt intoxicated by how clean the interior was. There wasn't a speck of dust on the dashboard or a piece of dirt on the floor. Nothing lying about and hardly anything special inside at all. The man didn't respond, and instead kept driving. 10 suffocating minutes later, she rushed outside when the car stopped almost in the middle of nowhere, alongside an old street by a small clock shop, sitting there with the snow glittering on the roof. Painted on the outside of the shop was the name, Charles's Clock Shop. Inside, the walls were littered with different ways of telling time, from ancient looking sundials to modern digital clocks. Almost unwillingly, she followed the man, whom she guessed was Charles, into the back. There wasn't much light, and what little light there was from the shop disappeared as the door slammed shut behind her and a deadbolt turned silently in its lock. A little ways ahead, a light illuminated a small part of the room. The man was there, gesturing to a chair. "Please, sit down while I work," he insisted, his voice smooth as silk. She obeyed, noticing how the light perfectly struck his face to show the almost stone-like quality of his pale skin. It was almost as if his face was the back of a clock's, and as she approached, a ticking sound slowly got louder. Almost immediately after she sat down, the light flickered back out of existence and the room seemed to be filled with the sound of ticking clocks. There was the click of a lens and the flash of a camera for a split second, and she heard footsteps shuffling around her. The uneven ticking was getting louder and louder by the second, almost like thunder in her ears. She almost began lifting her hands to cover her ears, but it was as if every one of her muscles had been frozen, when finally the ticking stopped as a light shone on the clock man. He was holding up her watch. This is your life, always ticking, until, unfortunately, it skips a beat. He paused, pulling up the dial on the watch to adjust the time. She felt her heart stop as he began rapidly spinning the time forward. He stopped it as it reached 12 and looked back at her. Before he could speak, she spoke to him with fear in her voice. Let me go," she barely whispered. Charles stopped to stare at her. "Now, why would you assume I'm not going to? Just wait a little bit. After all, I still need to fix your watch." His voice was mock of puzzlement, and his mouth spread into a wide smile to match the Cheshire Cat's. And with a subtle smirk cloaking beneath false kindness, he stepped closer and the light went out again. As the ticking thundered in her eardrums to match her heartbeat, and almost as quickly, she lost all senses. January 10th, 2013. Post from January 6th, 2013. Hello people, this is Genevieve again. I can't say much except that I think I'm free for now. I say for now because I just read what's written last in the journal, and I fear the worst. I'll just type everything for one last time. I hope that someday this will help someone in the future, and that my family and friends read this. Once upon a time, there was a young man that had an extraordinary talent for fixing clocks. Charles worked in his father's clock and antiques shop, 1053 Blackthorn Road. There, he would help anyone that came by to the shop with something that needed repair. One day, he was walking down the streets of London, just past midnight, preparing to confront the new year, when he saw a figure slightly shivering in Central Park. Almost immediately, she declined his help, and after a moment, he left to return to the shop. The lady spent the next couple of days restless, trying to focus on what had happened. Finally, 3 days after the incident, she noticed that a single token she had from the experience, a card, had an address that she recognized almost instantly. It was the address to James and Charles's clock shop at 1053 Blackthorn Road. Almost immediately, she was afraid. When she searched for the shop, there were no leads, and it was as if it was all false. However, she was not deterred, and finally decided to try and tell her story. No one would believe her though, thinking that she had made everything up. Finally, after a couple of days, she was home alone when she got a visitor, one due to change something important. After the encounter, she was even more scared, and decided to tell her story in full one last time. One last time she would be able to speak out before the clockman fixed up the clockwork of her heart. I recall my grandma's life and death only as I remember my mum telling me. From what I can gather, on February the 2nd, 1998, my grandma fell victim to a car accident and died in the hospital sometime later. She was the last of my grandparents on both my mum and dad's side to go. The rest had died long before I was born. I was only 3 years old at the time, and I have a hazy recollection of attending the funeral and seeing my grandma within the casket. I also vaguely remember being quite fascinated as my young mind had not understood the concept of death. I had been travelling for most of my life, considering my dad had worked for the United Airlines, so flying wasn't much of a surprise to me, even though I was only about 8. It was July 2002 if I recall correctly, and my mum had just landed in Chicago from Las Vegas, Nevada, where we were planning to live, and I still do. Customarily, we were driven by my Uncle Ray to my Auntie Linda and Uncle Joe's house in Algonquin. It was a pretty large house and was very cozy to say the least. My mum and I shared a room upstairs, which I believe was my cousin Laurie's room before she moved out. A rather strange coincidence occurred. My mum, Auntie Linda, Uncle Joe, and most of my relatives began to explain stories to me about our family reunions. This, in turn, led to talk about my grandma Lily, the one who the reunions became based around after her death. She was a great woman, very intelligent, very kind and very loving. She flawlessly brought up my mum, my aunts and my uncles. She was the role model for what every woman should be. On top of this, she was very healthy and had no medical ailments before her death, even with her growing age. She had been in her mid-70s at the time, and possibly may have lived to a century had it not been for that fateful day. Hearing these consistently sincere stories from my mum, my aunts and my uncles makes me wish she had lived so I could meet her. One thing so captivating about my grandma was that she was very loving, and she loved all of her children, her children's children, and her friends, and everyone around her with a warm heart. Then came a night that terrified me to the point that it still haunts me. It was about 2 days after the reunion, and my mum and I were getting ready for bed. We had to share one bed in the bedroom, which didn't bother me at all since I didn't start sleeping on my own until I was about 9. It was about 9 or 10 at the time, according to the classical red text digital alarm clock to sat on the nightstand. I woke up in the middle of the night and glanced at the clock, and I remember it being 1:36 AM. Rubbing my eyes and letting them adjust to the darkness, I saw that my mum had left the closet open. As my eyes finally adjusted, I saw a horrifying sight. It was a white figure, resembling an anthropomorphic cloud, vaguely shaped like a human, with no face and only barely discernible limbs. It looked like it was about to sprint across the room, as if it were a blurry shot of a runner in the middle of a race. I blinked my eyes and the figure had changed. This time, instead looking of like it was about to sprint across the room, it appeared to have its hands behind its back. It was staring at me with its faceless head, and I could only stare back, not knowing what to do. I was too frozen to even wake up my mum, who was in the same bed. I just stared, with no idea what to do. I hadn't even realised how much time had passed. It seemed as if morning simply crept up on me. I recall sitting up in the bed, having passed out for what seemed for a short period of time, and I woke to my mum getting ready to go to the mall to pass some time. I began crying, promptly asking my mum to ask me what was wrong. I explained what I saw to her that night. She tried to rationalise it as being a white dress in the closet. There was absolutely nothing white in that closet, only dark clothes. I searched it thoroughly to be sure of this. She had no explanation to this and simply asked me why I didn't wake her up. I didn't know why then, and I still don't know why now. My Uncle Joe, Auntie Linda and Mum all talked to me about it, and they said it was probably Grandma visiting and that I shouldn't be scared. It didn't change my feelings though. I remained scared. Years later, I heard that if a spirit is visiting a relative or a friend, then the hauntee won't feel fear when they see the ghost, despite the awe and surprise. This observation scares me that much more, since I was scared out of my mind at this entity, and I refused to believe it was my grandma. Up to now, I refuse to sleep with closets open, and I'm scared of waking up to see something staring at me. I still wonder what I saw in that closet, and whether or not it was my grandma. When I go back to the reunions, I make absolute sure the closet is closed, and I sleep with the light on in that house. I remember the day my dad bought the painting. The one of the boy dressed in Victorian clothes sitting on a wooden stool. My dad always had an affinity for classical looking paintings and other forms of art, and this one seemed to fit his tastes perfectly. The boy was about 9 years old, give or take a year, and his face was like the Mona Lisa's. You couldn't really tell if he was smiling or not. But the handiwork of this artist was remarkable. At least that's what my dad would always say. Even though he always brought home interesting pieces of work like this, his fixation on it seemed a bit odd. I was 17. We lived in Savannah, Georgia at the time, in a small house on Jones Street. It was filled with small sculptures and paintings, and even though the painting of the boy was exactly what my dad liked, it was rather large in comparison to the other paintings he had on our walls. He ended up taking down a couple of the paintings he had hung in our hallway between the foyer and the kitchen in order to fit it. But there it hung, dull but intriguing, staring back at me as I stared at it. My dad always took special care of this painting, assuring that it was hung straight, dusting it off every couple of days, even though there was no way dust could accumulate that fast. I would often find him staring at it, his face locked into this almost smile, transfixed on the boy. When I caught him, I'd always ask what he was doing, and his response was always the same. "Oh, nothing, just admiring my striking young boy." And every time I found it more and more odd that he referred to the boy himself and not the painting. It was just a painting after all, right? About a week after my dad hung the painting on the wall, I began noticing a few strange things. I heard laughter coming from the hallway, even though it was just my dad and myself in the house. And my dad wasn't in the hallway, and sometimes not even in the house. It was always very faint, just barely noticeable, and if I was listening to music or watching TV of the sort, I wouldn't have noticed it. But occasionally, when I was studying or dozing off for a nap, I'd hear it. Every now and then, I'd feel compelled to investigate, and so I traced the laughter to the hallway, only for it to stop when I rounded the corner. Once or twice, I thought I saw a shadow leap into the wall, but I convinced myself it was nothing. I was so wrong. There were other things that happened, like lights flickering or scratching coming from the walls, but the laughter is really what got to me. For weeks, the laughter continued. I heard it more and more often, and it seemed to be getting louder. I began hearing it in my dreams. I would be at the end of a small corridor, looking at the painting of the boy, and the laughter would begin. Softly at first, just barely audible, but over long minutes, the laughter would crescendo until the boy was laughing maniacally. As the laughter grew more sinister, his hint of a smile grew into a malicious grin, his eyebrows furrowing until he was glaring at me. I would always be paralyzed, rooted to the spot, unable to turn my head or close my eyes. As the laughter became deafening, the boy would begin to crawl from the painting, eyes wide with what seemed like bloodlust. He'd reach out to me, hands gripping at the air, as if he was looking for something to grab a hold of. Inch by inch, he would tear himself from the painting, coming closer and closer until his face was nearly 2 feet from mine. And finally, his hands would find my shoulders, but as soon as they did, his eyes rolled into his head, and the laughter became a deafening, blood-curdling scream. Then all of a sudden, I would wake up sweating, my heart nearly beating out of my chest. I told my dad about the dreams eventually, after it became unbearable to see the same thing over and over again. I told him I was scared to sleep for fear of seeing him. I'll never forget what he said to me. It chilled me to the bone. "Don't ever talk about him like that again, Phil." He said it in such a threatening tone. I didn't even recognize it as my dad's voice. He never got angry at me. And over the painting, there was something wrong. And the painting was that something. It just had to be. I knew that I had to get rid of it, one way or another. Something happened to my dad, and I couldn't take the dreams anymore. I'd planned to burn the painting the next day while my dad was at work. That night, I had the dream again. The same beginning as always. The boy in the painting just staring at me, his Mona Lisa smile looking so evil as the laughter grew louder and louder. He peeled himself out of the painting again and grabbed me. But there was no scream this time. The boy stopped laughing and instead spoke to me. His voice wasn't of a 9-year-old boy though. It was low, layered, demonic. He spoke only 5 words. "It won't work. He's mine." After that, I woke in a sweaty panic again. But rather than lay in bed with my light on the rest of the night, I decided that it had to be that night. I couldn't wait any longer. Whatever it meant by "he's mine," well, I just knew that I had to do something right then. I threw my sheets off myself and walked to my door. That's when I heard it. The laughter. Only this time, it wasn't just from the painting. I could hear the soft, low tone of my dad's laughter too. I had no idea what to think. I slowly opened the door and let the darkness outside my room pour in. I didn't know what to make of the laughter I heard, so I wanted to be careful. I walked down the stairs so slowly that I wasn't sure I'd make it to the bottom before the sun come up. I was never so thankful to have quiet stairs, because it seemed like no one had noticed I was coming. I could still hear the quiet giggles coming from the hallway. After what seemed like a lifetime, I made it to the bottom of the steps. I inched my head around the corner until I could see what was in the hallway. Moonlight was shining through the window of the kitchen, making it easy to see the horror that was taking place in the middle of the hall. My dad was sitting on the floor. Across from him, the boy. They were silhouetted against the moonlight, but I could see the eyes of the boy, red like fire in the darkness. I could see his malicious grin, looking at my father as if he was planning to do something horrible. I knew that I had to think of something. Anything to get my dad away from that monster. I didn't know how much time I had before whatever was going to happen did happen, so I had to act quickly. I stood up and prepared myself to run for my dad. The laughter grew in volume, and I knew that I had to move. I charged, screaming into the hallway, and the laughter ceased as I saw my dad and the demon boy look straight at me. Meeting my scream with screams of their own, I faltered for a second, hesitating at the sheer volume that was assaulting my ears. I charged faster, but now towards the boy. He stood up in an instant and smiled, before vanishing. I was so shocked. I stopped dead. But almost as soon as he vanished, I heard the laughter, now echoing throughout the house, coming from nowhere and everywhere at the same time. I grabbed my dad, who reverted to his soft laughter, and pulled him to his feet. Suddenly, a knife came flying from the kitchen directly at my head. I ducked, but I felt the wind from the blade cutting through my hair. "You will not take him," I heard the demonic voice roar. With my heart racing, I backed towards the front door, knives still coming one by one, cutting my arms or face if I was too slow. "He's mine!" the voice screamed. I was nearly to the door when I felt myself hit something soft. I slowly turned to find the boy standing with his soft smile looking up at me. "You are not leaving," he told me in a softer but just as malicious tone. "You will stay." His soft chuckle was now resuming. I felt tears rolling down my face, but as his laughter grew louder, I bent down and grabbed one of the knives that had been thrown and plunged it into the boy's throat, diving for the door handle and sprinting with my dad into the night. I spent the rest of the night at St. Joseph's Hospital with my dad. He'd passed out while we were running from the house, and I couldn't wake him up. I told the doctor that saw me for my cuts that I tripped and cut myself on some broken glass, though I doubt he believed me. After that night, my dad finally seemed normal again. He apologized to me for everything and made sure I was okay. He burned the painting too. Now, 3 years later, we're still in the same house, though with less art around. My dad thought it would be best to cut back after what happened. The reason I tell you all of this is because I don't really think it's over. I occasionally catch my dad laughing softly to himself, as if in a trance that he doesn't wake from until I get his attention. I don't think the painting is really gone. I think it's still out there somewhere, like it would be in a horror film. So if you ever find a painting of a boy about 9 in Victorian clothing with a Mona Lisa smile, get rid of it. Once you hear the laughter, just run and pray. My neighbour is one of those annoying wannabe YouTube personalities. Over the years, I've seen him cough out cinnamon, lay flat on the hood of his car as it slowly creeps down the driveway, and douse himself in lukewarm water, all the while screaming epic win, epic fail, or fuck epic maintenance of the status quo for all I know. It can get tiring to watch him go about his shenanigans in the pursuit of viral fame. So when he knocked on my door the other day and told me he was going away for a few weeks, and asked that I get his mail, honestly, it was a relief. I can't explain the peace of mind I had knowing that I didn't have to brace myself for any of his stupidity for a while. I was always afraid his stunts would wind up bleeding over into my life. Things were pretty normal for the first couple of days. He received a few bills, a bit of spam, and what I could only assume was a birthday card. Then, one evening, I got home to find a cardboard box waiting on his front porch. In big red letters was written, "Return to sender." I'm no small fry, but I admit I had trouble lifting the box on my own. It was really freaking heavy. Lugging it across the road to my house was even harder, and I quickly realized there was no way I was going to drag it up the stairs and through my front door. I decided to leave his package in my garage. It wasn't like I kept my car there. The garage door was just a piece of shit that refused to open without a good thug and a whack. It was less trouble just leaving the car in the driveway than it was to fight with the garage door every morning and night. In hindsight, I should have set the package down while I struggled to open the tricky door. But you know how it is when you've got a good grip on something. No point in setting it down if you don't have to. It was as I kicked the door for a third time that I lost my grip on the package and it fell to the ground. I heard a light crack inside. Shit! I cursed. I hoped I hadn't broken anything important, but figured I would just tell my neighbour about it and let him assume the break happened en route. Hands free, I finally managed to get the garage door unstuck, and boy did it screech and protest as it rolled up and over me. I dragged the box the rest of the way, setting it in the corner for whenever my neighbour would come back and claim it, and then I forgot all about it. Until a few days passed, that is. I'm not sure exactly how long it took for the smell to waft from the crack under the garage door to the house, but it came in a slow progression. It was a sickly sweet odour, similar to a skunk, and for the first few days after I smelled it, I genuinely assumed that's exactly what it was. Roadkill that had left its mark on my house. It was only when I realised the scent was growing more intense instead of fading that I went to look for a source. That's when I opened the garage door, and that was when the odour knocked me back holding my nose. The culprit wasn't hard to identify. The only change in my garage was the box in the corner. I remember thinking it must have been one of those meat of the month subscription boxes. The meat must have gone rancid from being left out of the fridge for so long. But how much meat could have been in there for the box to have been so large and heavy? An entire freaking cow? I covered my nose as I approached the box, a pair of scissors in my hands. I probably wouldn't have needed them to open it. It had become soggy enough at the bottom to poke through with a finger, but I wasn't about to poke my finger into spoiled meat juices. That soggy bottom was the reason I had to open the box in the first place. If I tried to drag it out whole, everything would spill onto the floor. I was going to have to dump pieces of meat, one garbage bag at a time, and then take them down to the dumpster. A process I wasn't looking forward to. My scissors tore through the tape along the top of the cardboard box. I thought the smell couldn't get any worse, but as I flipped the flaps open, I discovered a whole new gamut of stink. It was like opening a burning oven, but instead of a heat wave, I was met with waves of piss, sweat, shit and putrefaction. It was so bad that I staggered back and I had to force down the puke begging to guzzle out of me. I don't think I could have handled the scent mingling with the horrors coming out of the box. I'm not ashamed to admit it, but I ran out of the door for a breath of fresh air. But in the short time I'd spent in the garage, the smell had become so ingrained in the fabric of my clothes that it clung to me like a shadow. Nothing I tried could keep the smell out of my nostrils. Not air fresheners, not a face mask, not 3 showers and a change of clothes. Every second that box lay open in my garage was another second the smell was allowed a foothold in my home. I had to bite the bullet. I returned to the garage, the flaps of the box still open as though inviting me to look. I was prepared. A clothespin pinning my nostrils shut, a garbage bag in one hand and the strongest cleaner I could find in the other, a long rubber gloves to keep my skin from having to touch what was inside. But as it turns out, I needed none of those things. I wouldn't have to touch or clean the contents of the box. I would only have to suffer nightmares every night. You see, there was meat in that box, but it didn't come from a cow or a pig. No, it was worse than that. It was my neighbour, dead. Still in one piece, but dead. I called the cops and naturally they took me in for interrogation. It's kinda hard not to suspect the man with the corpse in his garage after all. Thankfully, they soon realised I wasn't involved. My DNA might have been all over that box, the smell might have left a mark throughout my house, but there was one piece of irrefutable evidence in my neighbour's own hands that proved my innocence. A vlogging camera. They showed me the footage only once. I'm not sure if they were allowed to, or if they felt so bad for me they figured it couldn't hurt. Either way, I saw it. My neighbour was sitting in the box outside of a shipping facility, laughing as he told the world how he was going to mail himself across state lines. He'd brought pee bottles, food, a pillow, and a few flashlights. His friend, a guy I'd seen at his place several times to help with his stunts, closed the lid and presumably dropped him off for shipment. Throughout the next couple of hours or days, I'm honestly not sure, my neighbour recorded a few short clips about his progress. I think I'm in a truck now, I can feel it moving. Must be in a warehouse, pretty warm here, still got plenty of food, that kind of stuff. And then on the last entry, the box toppled over. He broke his neck and that was it. The camera recorded until either the memory card got too full or the battery died. There's one thing I didn't tell the police after they showed me the video. One thing I'd heard in the footage that would haunt me to the day I die. Just after the tumble that broke his neck, I heard the familiar screeching sound of my garage door. I've been a radio disc jockey for about 4 or 5 years now. I worked at the radio station since I was 16. I answered a lot of mail and delivered a lot of messages to the various employees that made up the tiny building they ran out of. I was like their pet that they watched grow up to become a DJ himself. However, back when I was first hired, I was always a bit shaken up by a man who was known as Mr. Sealers. He was not the boss by any means, but he was supposedly very vital to the production of the radio. They gave him an office without windows, and they gave him a title like Creative Director or something that I'm sure was not a real title at all. You did not have to know much about him. He was an eccentric man. His family constantly worried about him, and therefore he had his own personal assistant, who was actually a psychiatric nurse hired by his rich family to make sure he didn't hurt himself or something. Mr. Celius was always paranoid. He spoke of governmental spies, recording devices, and surveillance. He trusted no one, and could hardly look me in the eyes even though I was just a teenager then. He had an 8mm camera and a cassette tape recorder within arm's reach at all times. In meetings, he would lie his head down and play a loud tape that sounded like heavily degraded lo-fi music right to his ear. I could be across the room and still get a headache from it, but the man seemed immune. In fact, it calmed him down. He was seriously mentally ill, but he had some fantastic ideas. They kept him on because it would cost them more to replace him or to lose him. Now, if you think this is some story about some psycho who ends up killing his family and wearing their skin or something, you're wrong. This is not some awful depiction of the unfortunate mental illness. This is just something that happened to me that sends chills up and down my spine when I think about it. So anyway, I worked for quite some time answering mail, but even though I was usually in a quiet room full of envelopes, I was not too far from the daily drama of Mr. Celia's. He had many different moods. Sometimes he would not leave his office or not let anyone in. He would write out his daily contribution out on a notebook paper and slide it under the door. Other times he was all over the building. He recorded on his camera and laughed a lot. It was like everyday situations made him laugh and laugh. He could ask, "What time is it?" Someone could have replied 2:30, and he would have been on the floor laughing as if it were the best joke in history. There were times where he would refuse food because he thought it was rotten when it was not. He would sometimes refuse to drink water because he thought that they were pumping gasoline into the water system. He would not sleep for days because he thought people videotaped him while he was asleep. He collapsed of exhaustion 3 times and dehydration once. Twice he was escorted out of the building by police kicking and screaming, then was unseen while he was staying in a mental hospital for 6 weeks at a time. He was not creepy. He was just some guy who we all sort of pitied. However, with all the talk of surveillance and elaborate conspiracies about loss of privacy, people in the office felt ill at ease. It didn't help that Miss Celia's waved his camera around all the time. Not always was it like that, only when it was quiet. The times that Miss Celia's was away at his hospital, or when he was refusing to leave his office, that was when it felt like one was not alone. Then one day, we started having broadcasting errors. We would be on air and then suddenly cut out. We would have very low quality sound from either minutes or hours. Then there would be silence, a loud long beep, and perfect sound once again. This began happening frequently, but no one could identify the problem. Someone suggested that it was possible that there were two things trying to be broadcasted at once, but no one was running anything other than our programs. It would happen so frequently that listeners would begin noticing it. We began having the reputation that we had low quality broadcasting, when that was not true at all. After about 3 months of being in the dark as to what the problem was, one evening around 3:47 in the morning, it happened again. Rich, one of our disc jockeys of the time, who usually ran the late nights and early mornings, was playing music. No one usually listened at that time of morning, so we ran a few advertisements and a heavy amount of cheap music. Then all of a sudden, the sound became distorted. Rich had no idea, but Mrs. Jennings, who was listening to it, could hear the sound cut into a loud static. The static had a high pitch to it, and an eerie undertone. If you listened closely, you could hear a man talking in a low, motionless voice. Mrs. Jennings made everyone who was present listen, including the janitor, and they all could not understand where it was coming from. No one was at the office at all, and everyone who was stood in the room listening to the weird transmission. Mrs. Jennings started recording onto a blank tape. She was not recording when it first came on, but afterwards she did. The voice stopped, cleared his throat, and then went silent. There was no voice, just static. Then there was a very faint and then another That part was only heard after the recorded tape was played back. The static stopped and went to solid silence. Then, after the sound of a telephone dial and a click, the music began playing. When I came in that night, they made me listen to the tape and told me what happened. They made our tech specialist listen to it, and he began to suspect that someone could be hijacking the broadcast signal. He said it was possible that whoever was doing it could be causing the problems we've been having, and that this person was unsuccessful before. Still, it was a big deal. Even if it was at 3 in the morning, it was illegal and causing us a lot of problems. We decided to see if it would persist. For the longest time, it did not. We continued as normal and the problem stopped. This continued for months until one day just around noon, the signal cut out and became a clear, near staticless sound unlike before. This time, it sounded like a tape recorder of someone speaking being played backwards. There were different sounds, faint voices, and a familiar sounding one that sometimes whispered and sometimes spoke in a concerning tone. It was all played backwards, so we had no idea what it said. We were able to catch most of it on our own recording, and when we played it backwards, thus making it played normally, we were shocked to hear the familiar voice was Mr. Celia's, and the other voices were snippets of conversations with him, recordings of past broadcasts, and what sounded like the recording device being set next to a television during a film. Miss Celia's was immediately questioned about the incident, and without blinking, he admitted to the broadcast signal intrusion. It was never reported on, mostly because everyone felt bad for him, and the next day he was fired. He went off to live with his mother or something. I didn't hear much about it. His office was emptied, but he left a ton of tapes behind. I listened to a few of them out of curiosity. Some of them were awful, heavily degraded music. Others were sounds of conversations, TV, radio, and single records. It was eerie, like some sci-fi movie material. I nicked a few of the tapes for myself. They were just going to throw them in the dumpster back anyway. I took 2 and I still have them. Anyway, I eventually became a DJ a year or 2 after Miss Celia's was fired. It was a great gig. I started working the early mornings and later moved up on the time slots with more listeners. Without Miss Celia's, The place was quiet, and it was normal. However, we were lacking creatively, and we were all pushed to our creative limits. Television was much more popular than radio, and we needed to give people a reason to listen. I was working one morning, and it happened again. It was between 5 and 6 in the morning, and I was drinking coffee to keep me awake during the end of my shift. I spoke occasionally on air, mostly introducing songs to a few listeners at a time. Some were getting up for their early paper route or were trucking. I knew my possible audience. I played the best rock and roll I could find for them. I was listening to what was being broadcast through the headphones, and then they began to click. It cut out the sound of every other second and then stopped, playing just dead air. I was tired and on a caffeine high. Every ghost story and horror movie I knew played through my mind. My heart started pounding and I took my feet off the table. Suddenly, it went to what sounded like a tape recording. I heard a chair squeak, like someone was sitting at a table. It sounded like someone had simply leaned forward in a chair. Of course, I almost had a meltdown. I didn't even think to hit the record button. Then it came back. There was a second of dead air and then the sound of rock and roll once more. I was on edge until my shift ended. Then the sun was beginning to rise and I calmed down the second I was out of that eerie station. There's just something about radio stations. With all the recording and broadcasting devices around you, one feels watched when they are alone. Paranoid. Maybe it was just all of the energy. I heard that some kind of energy can make people feel on edge. I reported the problem, but no one really cared. After about a day, neither did I. The last time I heard it happen, it was probably the worst time. Once again, during my first year of being on air, I sat in the morning playing music. The second the sound cut out, I pressed record. It was cutting in and cutting out. I heard faint talking in with every cut. Then there was about 5 seconds of a tape played backwards. I could actually hear the stop button being pressed and snapping upwards. Then I heard a chair squeak very faintly. Once again, I only heard it the second time around. The last thing I heard was something that made me feel watched for weeks. I heard what I have later decided to be Mr. Celia's voice say, "It still works, Davey." Then it came back to a few clicking sounds later. I was stunned. If you did not already guess, Davey is what I've always been known by and called by the station workers. I called myself DJ Deer on air because it seemed hip at the time and catchy. I played the recording over and over again. Each time it sent chills down my spine. I once played it while I was going to bed. It was next to another musical tape of mine. I popped it in the stereo just for kicks. Even then it freaked me out. About half a year since the last incident, I saw Miss Celia's obituary in the papers. He'd fallen off his mother's rooftop. I was sure it was suicide, but then later I had heard through the grapevine that he'd gone up there one day in search of governmental satellites and had slipped off. His mother's gardener had found him dead a few hours after his mother had yelled at him for trying to cut open part of the wall in search for recording devices. She said he went outside in a terrible state of mind, and then he was dead. All just what I heard around the station, of course. Just like that, the man was dead. I listened to the other tapes that he'd left behind many times. It was rather interesting to listen to the odd snippets of his life. I kept it with my music. However, the "It Still Works" tape is something I'd gotten rid of long ago. Not on purpose, but it was probably for the better. I have no idea what he meant by what he said, and I still don't. But no, it did not mysteriously stop working or disappear. I was just so upset and bothered by the sound of him calling me out on air that I didn't keep it with my music. I moved from one apartment to the other and ended up putting a few boxes in storage during the process. I emptied the content of my unit except for a couple of boxes I did not care about. I stuffed the tape into a box of old scarves from my cousin and unused bedsheets from my dead grandmother. Then I realised that I didn't pay my storage bill one day, and I didn't care. I truly did not care that I lost the tape. So either the owner of the rental place threw out the boxes, or they auctioned them off. Even if some stranger listened to the tape, they would have no background. They wouldn't be freaked out like I was. The only result of all this was that I would never feel alone while recording. Sometimes a sudden memory of the damn voice of Mr. Celia's would pop up in my head and it would send chills up my spine. Every accidental click broadcast on the radio made me jump. I love being on air, but sometimes, especially early in the morning, it's simply nightmarish. I'm not sure if I'm going mad myself, but one time just a few months ago, I swear to the heavens I heard the faint voice of Miss Celia saying "It still works, Davey," underneath a low quality transmission to a pre-recorded advertisement. I always listen for it now, and that only makes me more likely to hear it. Maybe it's just me. Broadcast signal intrusion freaks me out.